Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that watched the wrong Queen's speech and now knows too much about Helen Mirren. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Well, as I was saying before we started the show, I'm all right, but just having a bit of a busy time at work and with life, but looking forward to a week off next week.
Oh, congratulations. Have you got anything planned for next week?
Oh, yeah, I'm climbing about 5 mountains.
Wow, okay. That's like
flying up to
Inverness.
Yeah, wow. Basically. Flying up to Inverness, spending 4 days in the Cairngorms, and then coming down via the Lake District should be good.
That sounds great. That sounds really good. Yeah.
It's going to be wet. Very wet. I've got a brand new coat I'm looking to test out.
It's wet down here in the south. I don't know what you would expect from Scotland this time of year, but yeah.
Wetter. So heading into our main story tonight, we're hot off the presses on this one, I believe, as we're going to cover the Queen's speech.
Yes, so the Queen's speech happened today, so that's Monday the 14th of October. And yeah, I just wanted to give a little bit of background to the Queen's speech, a couple of the specifics, and then move on to what we're going to look out for within the next 2 weeks, because in 2 weeks' time, let me just check, 2 weeks' time will be Monday the 28th, we will be running up to Brexit Eve. So there's a lot of stuff that probably is going to happen over the next 2 weeks. So yeah, it's good to set that up. So let me start with the Queen's speech. So while we were away, Parliament was prorogued successfully this time by Boris Johnson. The previous one, as we talked about last time, had been challenged in the courts and Boris Johnson had lost. Essentially, their decision was that it was too political, trying to suspend Parliament for what was 5 weeks during a very important session of deliberation, particularly on Brexit. This one was allowed basically because it happened over a much shorter period of time. Parliament was only shut for 3 days, and we've had the Queen's speech fairly quickly afterwards. The Queen's speech traditionally acts as like a wish list of what the government intends to do in its parliamentary term, and this is, historically it's been quite a good reflection of what gets done because governments tend to have strong majorities. It is a fact that you actually vote on a Queen's speech to pass it and say that, oh yeah, the House agrees with the legislative agenda that this government has put forward. However, this is going to be different for a number of reasons. So just to give you a bit of context to the speech, so the fact that it has to be voted on is a really big risk for the government. So Johnson has a minority government and of about minus 45 if all MPs that weren't a Conservative voted against him. And we've already seen the proof that it's failed to pass key pieces of legislation, mainly on Brexit issues. But the one that really stands out for me is that it was unable to suspend Parliament to have its own party conference, which is not only embarrassing, but when you've got 21 former Conservative MPs who you think might have some wish to see that happen, the fact that they didn't support it either shows you that Boris is in hot water with a lot of Parliament. This is clearly a Parliament that doesn't support his agenda. Also, doing the Queen's speech at this time still stops the debate on Brexit in particular in a number of ways. So Parliament was suspended on Tuesday the 8th. Guess what happens every Wednesday in Parliament? Yes. Which we've talked... No, go ahead.
Just going to give a quick aside. There was a chat with David Cameron on the Freakonomics podcast recently, which is interesting because I think similar to the fact that he's published his memoirs so quickly, which is he's kind of on the circuit for that. But they were talking to him about Brexit, the decision to actually make that happen. And one of his anecdotes was around how much time is involved in preparing for PMQs as Prime Minister. And, it basically, at the very least, you lose a whole Wednesday morning. Although he did say it was good to kind of prepare. By preparing, you would cover everything that your government was currently undertaking. So that was a good way to kind of keep track of things. But just, yeah, it is a big deal, a big use of the Prime Minister's time.
Yeah, and it's a big use of the House's time to try and scrutinise the government. That's the way they're meant to be held accountable. I think I've mentioned a couple of times I don't think Boris' PMQ style has been particularly good. to put it quite bluntly. I don't think he's a natural at PMQs, and because of the nature, maybe hostility towards him in Parliament, he's not keen to do it again. So I don't think it was a coincidence that Parliament was suspended on the Tuesday evening, so Boris didn't have to face PMQs last week. Also, once the Queen has done her speech to Parliament, Parliament is already scheduled to discuss it again for the next 2 days at least. In fact, Parliament is devoted to having about 5 to 6 days to try and approve everything to discuss the elements of the Queen's speech and approve the bills that are included within it. The Crunch Brexit summit happens on Thursday, so that's 3 days after the Queen has done her speech, which leaves virtually, no time for us to discuss what might happen that leaves no time for Parliament to discuss what happens in the run-up to those.
We can discuss it as much as we like.
We can, but have very little influence over the process.
God damn it, every time.
So yeah, again, that's kind of symbolic of Boris trying to quash debate. Parliament could be raising issues and trying to put even more things onto the parliamentary legislation, saying that, right, if you can't agree a deal by October the 18th, then you have to go and ask for extension. They could be doing more and more things like that, but they're not being allowed to because, the procedure and the history demands that you discuss the Queen's speech for a number of days. All of this kind of ties into the fact that why people were worried about Parliament being suspended for 5 weeks, then having this Queen's speech process, because essentially that takes 6 weeks out of the Brexit discussing process. You really see now how that did run down the clock. We've talked about how the government needs to have the Queen's speech legislation approved. This is usually in something called the humble address, where they say, look, the Queen said this, and we all like the Queen, right? So, because we're British and we have to, why don't we just agree with what she says? And usually, like I said, this passes without any worry. There's a real possibility that the government could lose this vote, and not only would that be very humiliating for Boris Johnson, it would again signify that this Parliament can't function and needs a new way to go forward. It is possible that if he loses the Queen's speech vote, that almost acts as a vote of no confidence in him. It's not just because you're not just rejecting one specific part of this government's agenda, you're rejecting its entire programme for the next parliamentary session. And that's huge. That means that, hey, these 26 bills, these 30 bills that we've got wrapped up in this Queen's speech, none of them are going to be passed. Why bother to go ahead with it at all?
If you were to infer that someone might be conniving and trying to ensure they got their speech passed, you could see that they might load such a speech with lots of policies that people would generally agree on.
Yeah, precisely. And this leads neatly onto my next point, that this Queen's speech has kind of been criticised as a party broadcast on behalf of the Conservative Party delivered by the Queen. Because Boris has not had a chance to enact any of his policies yet. He's a new PM who wasn't elected by the country, so therefore doesn't have quite the same majority or quite the same will amongst his own MPs as you normally would have at a Queen's speech. Now the Queen has a chance to sell this legislative agenda to the public, and if you've got the Queen saying it, people kind of think that it might hold more weight. People think that, the Queen implicitly agrees with these policies. She doesn't, but the Queen has been dragged into a lot of political stuff recently. She had to prorogue Parliament and then was told that she was misled. We discussed that last time. It's been discussed that if Boris Johnson lost this vote of no confidence or lost the Queen's speech, that he might refuse to resign to the Queen, something that all prime ministers are meant to do. That might make the Queen have to use her powers that she's not meant to. It's weird. We've talked about the Queen and her powers are strange. She has all these powers written down, but she's not allowed to use any of them. She's like an untrustworthy Superman or something. I don't know. She's just like nobody. If you use your powers, then we'll take them away. but, everybody's meant to abide by them nonetheless. So bringing the Queen into politics muddies the waters a little bit, and that's why a lot of people have, spoken against it. But it is quite clever of Boris Johnson giving himself the biggest platform to put forward his manifesto for the next election. Essentially, he might think that even if it doesn't get past Parliament, if the public agree on it, then he's already done a good move, because he'll be ready to, he can very clearly say, these are the acts that we will put forward and enact in our next Parliament if you elect me leader.
But I was just going to say, before we move on into the kind of what was covered in the speech itself, I just want to say, I've seen some footage of this today. I've not seen the whole speech. I've found a link to throw into the show notes. But obviously we're going to get into the weeds here. But for those of you who are not used to watching the Queen's speech, firstly, there's a lot of pomp and circumstance and silliness. One would. I've seen many of my friends on Facebook today being like, "What's this whole business with Blackrod?" Now, firstly, Blackrod is an amazing name. Sounds like a porn star name. It's not. But we have, I think, the first female Blackrod.
I believe so. Yes,
I believe that's the case.
Yeah.
And part of her duties, she has to knock on the door and then the Commons slam it in her face. Because it's supposed to show that the Commons are separate from the monarchy and, and the Lords, and that they are beholden to the people and not just to the monarch. And I don't know how long this tradition has been going on, but one would assume hundreds of years. It's a bit silly. There's a lot of silly things. There's a picture also in the show notes of the House of Lords with everyone sat down, in their cloaks and everything, which you don't normally see in the House of Lords today. But that's presumably what it would have been like all the time in the 1600s or 1700s. And yeah, there's a lot of regalia, a lot of pomp and circumstance. And the other kind of observation I want to throw in, the Queen did not look happy. She's 93. Mm-hmm. She's been dragged out there to deal with this. As we already said, like, she's been dragged into this already. She is shrewd. She's been doing this for a long time. She obviously realises she's being dragged in again. And it very much felt like getting a telling off from your nan, but in a very, very polite way. So yeah, I think I'll just, that was my initial opinions without seeing the substance of the speech, which we'll move on to now. So the first part of the speech was all about Brexit, wasn't it?
Yeah, so the Queen kind of jumps straight into it, and I've tried to use the exact... I've decided to go for extracts from the speech itself, and then my spin on it, because whenever you look at the Queen's speech, there's a lot of spin online, and all parties are trying to make it good for them. So hopefully I can cut through a little bit of that speech. I also promise I will not deliver these excerpts of the Queen's speech in the Queen's voice.
Hello!
As tempted as I am.
My ministers will work to implement new regimes. Oh, sorry, that's all you're getting.
Oh, no, okay. You can do the whole thing now. So, first part of the speech, bang, straight in there. My government's priority has been to secure the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union on the 31st of October. Really unsurprising, this. It's the one thing Boris Johnson has been going on and on and on about, and to get the Queen to say it up front shows you where the government's position still is. We've had a lot of talk recently of potential extension, and, trying to avoid this no-deal cliff edge. This is the Queen speaking on behalf of the government saying that no, not going to happen. So I think that makes it really clear. There's no surprise. It's top of that speech. Then she goes on. My government intends to work towards a new partnership with the European Union based on free trade and friendly cooperation. Again, that gives you a little insight into the negotiating tactics of the UK. That's Boris Johnson's line that he wants a deal and prefers it to no deal. So the Queen is saying that, yes, I want a deal here. And the free trade bit suggests that they don't want to be part of any customs union or tied to the EU in that way. So just a few sentences in, and you can already draw a lot from the Queen's speech and the government's direction. The next bit is a bit longer, but I'll just pull out like the main parts. My ministers will work to implement new regimes for fisheries, agriculture, and trade, seizing the opportunities that will rise from the European Union. By mentioning like fisheries, agriculture, and trade, you're kind of hitting the Brexiteers' golden 3 reasons for leaving the EU.
Yeah, these are the 3 things they wanted to take back control of, other than borders.
Yes, yeah, precisely.
I mean, trade is tied into borders, but they kept going on about how all these subsidies we get for agriculture are bad for some reason, and that we're not allowed to fish even though we are. But I suppose criticising those points is a bit by the by at this point. But yeah, they have definitely been talking about those for a long time.
Yes, those are like some of the most long-standing anti-EU arguments that hark back to the mid-90s. These are the talking points that have always been there. So to mention it will be rabble-rousing for Brexiteers. Then to move on, an immigration bill ending freedom of movement will lay the foundation for a fair, model, and global immigration system. We heard about the Conservatives wanting to end freedom of movement. I know we didn't really touch on the Conservative Party conference last time, and it seems a long way away. It seems a long time ago now. But one of the big things that came out of that was Priti Patel's speech, where she mentioned in no uncertain terms that the government would seek to end freedom of movement, and that came to like quite a big applause from the hall, and said that she would move that they would seek to move towards a more Australian points-based immigration system. Again, that's another big talking point. A lot of people might say, why did Britain vote for Brexit in the first place? The issue of freedom of movement and migration was probably one of the key issues there. So again, that might be a vote winner amongst the sort of harder right that exists within the country, and is something that the Conservatives haven't been shy about promoting, that's their intention after leaving the EU. But then it softens a bit. It says, my government remains committed to ensuring that resident European citizens who have built their lives and contributed so much to the United Kingdom have a right to remain, which again kind of stresses the point that Theresa May said a lot of the time in her speeches. I think Theresa May's Brexit speeches used to go, we will leave the EU, however, we will protect the EU citizens that already live here, and look for a way to make sure they aren't used as a bargaining chip in any negotiations that go ahead. I find this bit at least reassuring as part of it. It's one of those like scaremongering things, like what happens to people who are already living here. And we talked last time about some of the horror stories that have already appeared of people trying to get through the paperwork through the Home Office. Not that has improved anytime since, or at least I haven't seen any news stories suggesting it's improved, but at least it's reassuring to see it is the intention of the government in the event of a deal to make sure resident European citizens still remain within the United Kingdom. And finally, the last bit of on Brexit was steps will be taken to provide certainty, stability, and new opportunities for the financial services and legal sectors. Basically, the UK has a lot of banks in there and has a strong economy. It has a strong service-based economy that might be messed up by Brexit, or if we're suddenly out, we want to make sure that, we still stay strong. And also the legal sector will need to have a massive overhaul anyway, because you'll see a massive shift in sovereignty of some existing within the EU, and EU laws all becoming UK laws.
And I imagine lawyers are going to be... I mean, I suppose it's an age-old joke, isn't it? The lawyers always win out of all these things. But I mean, lawyers have got a busy time on their hands, which means money, money, money as far as they're concerned.
Yes.
It's the financial services sector that I could definitely see being more likely to be affected by Brexit, given that we have a special position. We've always had this kind of special position within Europe that has helped our financial sector, and we have a lot of financial institutions, especially in the city. So I think how that's going to be affected is more open to the vagaries of the market and so on. But lawyers are definitely going to have a lot to do, as always.
Precisely. I think the main tactic of the government is to adopt all of EU law. First of all,
that's a sensible rule. I think we discussed that before, but like just essentially saying everything that was an EU law becomes a UK law, but with a different name or whatever they have to do.
Yeah.
And then they can muddle with it later on, but that's the simplest move, right?
Yes, precisely. So, yeah, again, those lawyers may see new opportunities to change laws, so that might be what that's speaking about. But, yeah, the first bit of the Queen's speech was always going to be about Brexit, and I think it's fairly... It does parrot the government's line, or at least Boris Johnson's line, very effectively. A lot of it, you could say, is pretty much the same as what Theresa May wanted to do. I think the ending freedom of movement is something that Theresa May got as part of her original deal. She was able to drop that part, but the commitment to the 31st of October has, like, Boris Johnson's stamp all over it. So it's got a very Boris theme, this speech already.
So I think it was it 7 bills in the Brexit section? So there's 26 bills in total in the speech.
I believe so, yeah.
So that is obviously an awfully large chunk of it thrown at Brexit, and with good reason. It's pretty much the only thing we've been able to talk about for the last 3 years, and it needs to get sorted. So I think we're all fine with that being in there, regardless of your opinion of it. Like, it needs to be discussed. Next up, the economy, which always an important talking point for politicians. What was in the Queen's speech there?
Yeah, so I was kind of amazed at how short this next bit is. There are a few bits later in the speech that kind of go towards the Northern Powerhouse idea, but the fact that this bit is so short and right at the start, I think, outlines the government's main strategy on the economy. So it goes, my government's new economic plan will be underpinned by a responsible fiscal strategy, investing in economic growth while maintaining the sustainability of public finances. It's super short. Like, 2 lines to that without a bill attached to it seems kind of mad to me.
But they do say they're going to have an emergency budget in November.
Yes, precisely. They've targeted it for November the 6th, which I think is really odd timing. There was a big Robert Peston thread about this today that kind of sums this up probably better than I do, but Peston's point was that if you have a budget on November the 6th, that's essentially an election budget, and the election budget's, because Boris Johnson is harking, he's trying to get a general election. Labour says once no-deal Brexit is stopped, they're happy to do an election. So the next budget is going to be one aimed at the voters. And usually the government promises to spend a lot in those pre-election ones. The problem with that is that comes alongside official forecasts from the Office for National Statistics, which is an independent organisation. It's not meant to favour the policy of the government in any way, shape or form. It's just meant to tell you the facts or its forecasts. And if the government has crashed out with a no deal by then those forecasts will be severely hit. The general knowledge is that, the wider accepted knowledge is that, a no deal Brexit would be bad for the British economy. And to try and deliver a budget on those terms and spin it as a popular election budget is going to be really, really hard for the Conservative Party. So I'm not quite sure why they're going to do that. The one gamble he might be taking is that we don't get a deal on the 31st, but extend. The Office for National Statistics is forced to release something that says, by the way, the delay of Brexit from, April 2019, if we delay it all the way to January, has affected the economy by X amount. That might be a way of selling it to the voters that we need to get this done and delay is a bad idea. Yeah. But still, it seems a little bizarre that, and that's the main point I wanted to raise on the economy.
So I just want to throw, I've thrown that tweet thread by Robert Peston into the show notes. Basically just saying what a crazy time for a budget, as you say, because they're going to be making a forecast based on his chosen scenario, which is just a standard free trade agreement. And that does seem pretty odd. And I'd just like to point out the top reply to that, which is, you remain bemused that an incompetent government continues to demonstrate they are incompetent. Which is quite good.
Touche. Touche.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's all well good laughing at that, but we have to live here. Not much really to go on, as you say. We can talk about the date being weird, but there's very little in the speech on this topic. So moving on, another topic, and this is actually quite interesting because this will refer back to, I've already mentioned that Freakonomics podcast episode with David Cameron in. He was saying that one of... now, Cameron has always been pro-NHS, as far as I'm aware, where unlike some other Conservatives who want to sell bits off, he, in his discussion on the Freakonomics podcast, was talking a bit about that, and he said one of his greatest regrets was like not kind of selling that as well. He was like saying like, we'd done quite well on the NHS, but then Brexit happened, essentially. But one of the things he touched on was that the NHS currently doesn't support social care and mental health in the same way as it does, injuries and A&E and stuff like that. So that kind of ties into the point that was made in this Queen's speech.
Yes. So the Queen's speech says that measures will be brought forward to support and strengthen the National Health Service, its workforces and resources, enabling it to deliver the highest quality care. New laws will be taken forward to implement the National Health Service's long-term plan in England and to establish an independent body to investigate serious healthcare incidents. The government also brings forward proposals to reform adult social care in England and ensure dignity in old age. My ministers will continue to reform the Mental Health Act to improve respect for and care for those receiving treatment. So, as you said, it ties into a lot of the social care aspect. This is something the government has been pushing. As we mentioned last time, social care was one of the weaker facets, maybe, of Theresa May's policy in 2017 during her election campaign. So the government will be seeking to right some of the wrongs of that. And if they're going
famously, she poorly sold a policy that is almost identical to what Labour's offering.
Yes. And then said the famous, nothing has changed exchange, when it was very clear that something had kind of showed May losing control of the narrative somewhat. Again, that 27 campaign is fascinating in several ways, but that's the bit that sticks in my mind the most. The other parts of this bill, sort of like touching on mental health and dignity in old age, they're probably solid vote winners. That's something that parties from all sides, I think, agree on, need action on now. So to see it in the Queen's speech is refreshing and comforting, and it's something Boris Johnson will want to promote a lot. Ways to fund the NHS is clearly a vote winner. It was something that was in the 350 million goes to the EU. Why not give it to the NHS? Was the campaign slogan of the famous one on the side of the bus. So Boris will want to be seen as giving money to the NHS. His claims on how much money he's given, I think there was a claim of 40 new hospitals that was put up and then quickly retracted, even so much that the BBC had to retract a story that had run on it because the government had given them slightly wrong information in the first place. The 40 new hospitals or centres that were being built had actually already been built, and it wasn't all above board. So, the government's still playing some of their tricks in that matter. But it's clear that health, which is a big issue in any election campaign, the government is trying to get ahead of the issue on this one and say it's going to be putting money into the areas they feel matter most. And I kind of agree that those are the areas that matter most at the moment.
And then another big Conservative drumbeater, law and order. We've already seen Bojo up in front of a large wall of police cadets that gives, as we said, had a certain type of optics that maybe was not what was intended. I think the general points here is that there's a lot of stuff talking about violent crime, which is a very kind of Conservative line to take, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's been clearly an increase in the focus the media has had on knife crime, particularly in London. I think there have been a number of high-profile incidents, and there has been a clear statistical rise in knife crime in London over the past few months. And I'm sorry, not just in London, and also in major cities as well. I believe I read that the analysis had been done, and that there was a spike. And so the Conservatives are looking to say, look, we will have, this speech says that the government is committed to addressing violent crime and strengthening public confidence in the criminal justice system. New sentencing laws will see that most serious offenders spend longer in custody to reflect better the severity of their crimes. That there is usually a common gripe, particularly of the right-wing newspapers, that somebody gets sentenced, but oh goodness, they only got sentenced 3 months for doing something awful. Those tend to be spun out of control or lose a bit of context, but still, I think there is a wide public perception that offenders are not put in prison long enough to reflect the severity of their crimes. So the Conservatives beating the drum on that will get other Conservatives to the ballot box. The only other things I wanted to touch on in here is measures will be introduced to improve the justice system's response to foreign national offenders. That kind of ties in again with Brexit. Brexit is going to have, particularly if it's a disorderly Brexit, it will bring in a lot of questions over the extradition of people from Europe. Britain usually works very closely with Britain usually works very closely with other police forces across Europe to make sure people that, try and jump the UK to go and escape into Europe don't have, are able to be brought back to the UK and face justice here. There's a bit at the end of the bill as well that, there's a extradition provisional arrest bill which will be award power to arrest individuals who are wanted by trusted international partners. All of that's going to come super important in Brexit, and the government wants to say right now, yes, we're going to take control of that and make sure that we don't lose any law and order, or we don't lose sight of law and order while we're trying to get the Brexit bill through. This is all classic Conservative rhetoric on law and order, and probably will be a vote winner for those on that side of the political argument.
Yeah, I think possibly, so no, it's not obvious from this bit of the speech, but one of the more concerning things I saw was something saying that it's going to equate like manslaughter and murder and make those all equivalent crimes in seriousness, which kind of seems to defeat the point. But yes. I don't know if, again, that may be, there's a difference in that and sentencing. Like you could say, while generally I feel those things should be kept separate and should have their own sentencing guidelines, there may be some more nuance to this that I haven't had a chance to explore. For example, it could be that they're saying the maximum sentence is the same for all of them or something, which would not happen in practice because judges follow precedents, for example. But I'd have to have a look into it in further detail. But I think that was one takeaway I saw from some people who've been reading up on it, which doesn't sound great to me. I generally think I get there are some very serious crimes that people might struggle to be rehabilitated from, especially repeat offenders and all of that. But rehabilitation is a thing I think we should focus on more, as opposed to just bunging people in prison where they stay for ages and then don't. When they come back into society, it's not surprising they reoffend because they've lost touch with the outside world essentially.
Yes, precisely. And I feel that you raise a good point about it's not obvious from the Queen's speech that that's involved, because the Queen's speech is written by the government and is designed to kind of be a bit fluffier. It's not the harsh text of the Act. So, yes. This is all spin in a way. So you read that and might go, oh, that's, the public might listen to the Queen's speech and go, oh, well, that sounds sensible. And then you get into the nitty gritty and think, oh my goodness, this is terrible to equate murder and manslaughter as the same thing. This really can't go ahead. There's a good example we'll be coming on to later, which I initially read as quite an innocuous line in the Queen's speech, which you think, oh yeah, I would agree with that. And then you see what the bill is, and then you think, oh no, that's terrible in lots of ways. So, it's weird how the Queen's speech works and the way it's spun. And I think that law point you've just raised is an excellent example of that.
Yeah, there'll be a link in the show notes from The Guardian talking a bit more about that. Again, it's very much an overview, so there may be some more details. I haven't had a chance to read that whole article as I grabbed the link. But I think, to take with a pinch of salt my immediate opinion on that, because I haven't yet had a chance to fully research it. So moving on from that, not something I necessarily expected to see in the Queen's speech, actually. Devolution. Yeah,
this point here is always brought up, and it kind of rolls on in the background, I think, from myself at least. I obviously have a very English perspective of things, and devolution has been something that has existed in this country for a long time, ever since Tony Blair's government in 1997 decided to give more power to the Scottish and Welsh parliaments, and we've seen the slow devolution of Britain. It's been an issue that's kind of been on the back burner. It's one that's slowly coming to the forefront, and the fault lines are caused by most things at the moment, Brexit. But we'll go on to the content of the speech and then say why it's related. So the speech says, "The integrity and prosperity of the union that binds the four nations of the United Kingdom is of the utmost importance to my government. My ministers will bring forward measures to support citizens across all nations of the United Kingdom." It also goes on to mention that my government remains committing to working with all parties in Northern Ireland to support the return of a devolved government and to address the legacy of the past. So that union and those four nations, the Conservatives see themselves as the party of the union and the one that's stopping the many forces trying to pull Britain apart at the moment. One of those big ones is Brexit, which Scotland can point to the result in 2016, and say, look, Scotland didn't vote for Brexit. We very clearly rejected it as a majority, and if you force us to go into a no deal that crashes the Scottish economy, well, why don't we have an independence referendum and run ourselves and then hop back into the EU that way? These calls are growing. Like a recent poll showed there was a 50-50 split in Scotland between wanting independence and not. That's coming up to the highest it's been since the Scottish referendum. And shows that is growing. As we tick down to Brexit Day, that's growing, and the SNP has always said that it wants to have another vote on the issue. If Brexit goes bad, more likely that grows even more. So the government is keen to say, look, we're going to try and keep this all together.
And this was also the bit that most felt like being told off by your nan.
Yes, I guess the Queen is like, look, I've kept this country together for loads and loads of years,
and you're just going to mess it up now. I'm 93. Come on.
Yeah.
Look, if you do this, I'm going to drop dead and leave Charles in charge. Charles in charge of our days and our lives.
Charles in charge. Just quickly petition for that to be our new national anthem once the Queen goes. That should be.
Sorry for that distraction there.
No, it's all right.
It's a tough time in politics. We need to laugh at something.
Yes, and after Scotland, you've got Northern Ireland, which is also very important. I mean, even more so to the Conservatives now, because obviously they're in alliance with the DUP, and they're depending on them for any eventual Brexit deal. We haven't really touched on this yet, but in between the podcasts, we've had a release of what Britain's alternative proposal would be for the Irish border. The Irish border was always a sticking point, with both sides saying that they don't want a hard border. The UK going to the EU, well, your suggestion of a backstop we can't accept. The EU said, okay, you come up with an alternative to the backstop and we'll be happy to hear your suggestion. Boris Johnson kind of came back with this one that suggested there would be a customs area which has two borders, sort of 30 miles away from the official border where the checks would happen, which seemed like kind of bizarre plan at the time to me, because you're essentially creating three borders: the actual border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, a new one in Northern Ireland where you have your customs checks there, and another one below it. You're kind of shifting the problem, not solving it. Somebody mentioned that over 500,000 people live in that border zone area, so what happens to them with their trade, customs and goods, that was unclear. Some people also, I think some from Labour, called it like a smuggler's paradise, the fact that you've got this buffer zone with so many living in there, you're just creating a whole new area of uncertainty. If the EU were to accept this plan as well, or avoid a hard border, it would likely leave Northern Ireland still remaining in a customs union, which would mean Northern Ireland would have different rules to the rest of the UK. This is something the DUP are desperate to avoid, and might be a reason why they don't support any deal that had that. The same reason they rejected Theresa May's deal, essentially. With tensions very high in Northern Ireland, if there be a potential for maybe unrest in Northern Ireland, I think that might be a bit strong, but certainly tensions are high and there's a lot of worry that any deal could affect the Northern Ireland peace process. The Conservatives need to be seen as being the party of union and wanting to keep that together. So it's, again, that's no surprise why they've mentioned the importance of the union and then again brought out Northern Ireland in particular for a notice to say, look, we are focused on Northern Ireland. We know this is a problem. Sorry, maybe not a problem. We know Northern Ireland is very important to the UK. This is something that we work, a lot of government time will be spent on in our parliamentary session to make sure we get this right.
And I think it's outside of the peace process, which we remember from when we were kids. I think a lot of people don't realise a lot of the issues going on in Northern Ireland. For the average person, I suppose you only kind of think of Northern Ireland when you look at the instructions on a competition on the back of a pack of crisps, and it says, it doesn't apply in Northern Ireland. This is something we're traditionally not very good at as a country, our governments have not been. There's currently a court case going on about a Northern Irish woman who, under the rules of the Good Friday Agreement, tried to get applied as an Irish citizen for a passport for her husband, who's a US citizen, and was denied on the basis that she's British. Well, the Irish government kind of turned around and went, oh, whoa, we set up all these rules. You're supposed to be respecting them too, because according to the Good Friday Agreement, someone living in Northern Ireland can identify as either Irish or British and pick their favourite. And this has led to they can basically say, I am this, I am that. And I think basically the British, the Home Office is saying, no, you're British because you live in Northern Ireland, which is not in line with the Good Friday Agreement. So we're pretty bad at this, and we need to get better. So, while I'd like to think they are going to follow through on stuff helping out Northern Ireland, I don't think we particularly have form in this area, and that's not just under the Conservatives, that's just in general.
Sorry, yes, as a whole, the UK government has been poor dealing with Northern Ireland issues, which was why it was so important to have a working devolved government in Northern Ireland, and that's under a threat of breaking down at the moment as well. So,
it's not been in session for 2 years, is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Which raises which causes more problems as well. It means that there has to be more rule from the UK, from England and Parliament over there, which looks bad and doesn't help towards the peace process at all and that healing area. So, yeah, it's messy over there, and it's certainly an area the government needs to address. If it has the time to address it, that's another thing. But Brexit certainly isn't helping that issue any.
No, it's a bit of a mess, I think, is the short summary. So, again, moving on to things no one asked for. Voter ID.
Yeah, so this is the example I wanted to pull on as the one that I thought, that seems pretty innocuous. But when you look closer...
I feel like this is being mentioned because they have to, but also they're trying to push this under the rug. That's how this comes over to me, but I'm sure we'll get into it in a second.
So, I'll do the exact words from the speech. It says, my government will take steps to protect the integrity of democracy and the electoral system in the United Kingdom. Great, you think. That sounds good. Who wouldn't want integrity in your democracy? That sounds wonderful. However, the actual bill they're looking to bring in is the need for citizens to bring voter ID to polling stations to prove they are who they say they are, and then you can vote. What's your opinion on this? Just shoot from the hip. Tell me what you really feel about this.
Well, my opinion on this is that this is a thing that is being tried by the Republicans a lot in the US as well. And there is very little evidence of voter fraud, which means this is basically an unmeasured response to a problem that doesn't really exist. It is going in, guns blazing, and there's I don't have the numbers on me right now, but the number of people who commit voter fraud is tiny, if there are any. It's that kind of, when I say tiny, it's in those numbers. It's like someone might accidentally do it. It's probably more likely to be the case than anything else. There were trials for this during the last local elections? Because I think we touched on it in our episode.
Yes,
and there were lots of stories of people being turned away who were legitimate voters. And often it was the case of, oh, okay, fine, I have to go home and get my ID. Now, I'm someone who always carries some form of identification on me because it's useful for a variety of things. You may know I have another podcast about alcohol. Turns out, even with a beard, you still need to prove you're over 18 sometimes. There'll always be someone at a checkout who'll be like, are you over 25? And I'm like, yes, I am. Anyway, that's by the by. But yes, I tend to have ID on me, but A, some people just don't. They're not in the habit of it, because they haven't generally needed to. And B, identification costs money. And this is where the main sticking point is, I think, in a lot of cases, is that this disadvantages poorer voters because, and this may be more of an issue in the US than it is here, but, you know, having a piece of identification costs money. You normally have to have something, but, you know, passports are expensive. What if your passport's out of date? Because it does show you are who you say you are, but also it's out of date, so it's not valid. And that's often a problem in these cases. A lot of people have driving licenses that are still paper because you can hold on to your paper. In fact, I was surprised to find out that you didn't have to have a photocard license in the UK. Turns out, as long as you haven't changed address, you can hold on to your paper license indefinitely, essentially. Yeah. Which that did surprise me. I found that out the other day, and I was like, I just assumed everyone had been moved over to photocards. But that's another potential issue. I know people who are, people who help drive minibuses for my scout group and things like that, upstanding members of the community who might not have photo ID of themselves because their driving license is not a photo ID card. We don't have a national system of ID cards. I know there was a time where someone tried to float that idea, but that's just not a thing we have in this country. So it's not reasonable to assume that everyone who wants to vote will have ID on them. Seeing as there is essentially no problem that they're trying to fix, this does just seem like it's targeted at disadvantaged groups or people who may not happen to have photo ID on them or own it. So, and there's also one other fact about that thing from the trial is that if someone is turned away, a legitimate voter trying to vote, now, you'd like to think someone's like, I'm going to go do a democracy. I've been turned away from democracy. I'm going to go back home. I'm going to gather my thoughts and then go back and do democracy properly this time. But if you get turned away from a thing that you were doing on your way to work or something like that, well, you might just not go, and that affects voter turnout. And we already have low voter turnout in most elections, so it's not helping people stay engaged with democracy. In fact, I would argue quite strongly that it is not protecting the integrity of our democracy because it's reducing the number of voters, and therefore skewing the results based on who is actually voting when you reduce those numbers.
Yeah,
I sound like this was a party political broadcast for Tom for PM.
No, I couldn't agree more. A lot of my time at university and my dissertation was all about voter turnout, particularly in America, and you have a look at the different factors that affect voter turnout, and it can be, something big like allowing, when people register in the US, you have to register to vote in some states like up to a month before the election, and that's a big barrier to turnout because some people might not have decided to vote or who they're voting for. Maybe they're not even thinking about the election a month out, and suddenly a week before they're like, oh, I finally have an opinion, go to the polling station and go, oh dear, sorry, you're not registered, can't do it, and get turned away. So that's quite a big thing that can turn you away. But sometimes it's things like the weather. It's been proven that on days where it rains, turnout tends to be lower. If you can't get transport to your local polling station, that's an issue. Particularly us in the UK, we're stupid. We decide to have our general elections on every Thursday, which is a work day traditionally, and it's not a public holiday. So again, that means that people have to either vote before work or after work, and if there's queues, it's just the more little barriers build up, the less like you are that somebody who's not that engaged in politics will vote. So bringing in something like voter ID, I think, is just like yet another hurdle, and quite a big one at that, to a lot of voters or potential voters within the UK. So, yeah, I agree with you a lot there. I think it's a damn stupid idea.
So, my party political broadcast for the Me Party aside, how did the actual political parties respond to this speech? So let's start with Labour as the main opposition. Her Majesty's opposition, in fact. They must be against the speech, right? That's how this works.
So, yes, so Labour responded to the speech. Jeremy Corbyn said, The Prime Minister promised us that this Queen's speech would dazzle us. On closer inspection, it turns out to be nothing more than fool's gold. There has never been such a farce as a government with a majority of -45 and a 100% record of defeat in the Commons, setting out a legislative agenda they know cannot be delivered in this Parliament.
Savage burn.
Yeah, exactly.
I feel like we've got a bit more casual this episode, but this is slowly unraveling as we get closer to Brexit.
Hey, everything's slowly unraveling, man. Just gotta roll with the punches.
Britain, basically a very large jumper. We caught on a fence 3 years ago.
Now it's a little mankini. Yeah, I think that reiterates the point that Labour's saying that, like, why are we even having a Queen's speech? This is stupid. You're not going to get this through. Corbyn saying it's not even that good, so why bother with it? What we'd expect from the Labour government, say that, and he also added later on that we may only be weeks away from the first Queen's speech of a Labour government, and in that Queen's speech, Labour will put forward the most radical and people-focused programme in modern times, a once-in-a-generation chance to rebuild and transform our country. So that's Corbyn kind of spinning it and saying, here's what you could have had, people. This is the Queen's speech you could have had from Labour would have done this. I think a lot of Labour's criticism of the Queen's speech was that it shouldn't happen. It's a party political broadcast, a lot of what we've said before. And that, another big point was that they said they've had 3.5 years to get Brexit done, and they failed. And it's a good, I think, particularly given the last parliament.
It's a fair criticism, one, I would say.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's been one of the longest parliamentary sessions it is the longest parliamentary session in history that we've come out of. One that started when Theresa May formed her government in 2017 and has just ended now. In that time, the government has, lost a prime minister, gained a new one, failed to progress on Brexit, and because so much of Parliament's time has been taken up with Brexit, other acts that could have got through have stalled, and it hasn't progressed much. It feels the country's been in a bit of a period of stagnation when it comes to getting big things through. And there's a lovely research briefings paper that I've linked you to, but there's a graph basically of the number of acts from 1900 to 2009. And even though they add in the ones from the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly, there's a noticeable dip in 2019 to around about 20 that shows that from January, essentially our system has become very, very clogged and unable to move forward. That's Labour's biggest attack line, and kind of shows, again, I think, why there's still noise about a general election. We keep coming back to it. We keep going forward, but that's why there's been so little progress. It's because Parliament is stuck, and it's stuck particularly over the issue of Brexit. So I think now we've kind of dealt with the Queen's speech a little bit, it's worth just having a quick look at what's gone on in Brexit now and what's happened in the background to the run-up of the summit that's happening on Thursday the 17th.
Yes, no, I think it's... So, for people who aren't aware, this is the last EU leaders' summit before Brexit is supposed to happen. So this is where really the last-ditch effort for a deal has got to come this week. I believe it's Thursday we will know by, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
So that by the end of Thursday, we should know if the EU leaders have voted on a proposed deal between the UK and the EU, and then that would obviously then have to come back to Parliament to be passed before the 31st of October, which, as we've already stated, quite a short timeline, and especially if they haven't substantively changed anything, might struggle to get it through. Though there have been some interesting moves in the last week. There's been a lot of talk of compromise. The Taoiseach of Ireland, Varadkar, was over talking to the Prime Minister at the same place that Colleen Rooney got married, just to show you how much we love our Irish counterparts. I think that's the only thing that everyone's been talking about in the news with relation to that venue. They're like, oh, it's a lovely old house, but also Colleen Rooney had her wedding there. Don't know why that kept being brought up by Brexit Cast and other shows.
It's because of Wagatha Christie. You've heard of Wagatha Christie, right? And all
I have not.
Oh, okay, you don't know about it. Okay, it's been great. So, like, complete aside, if other people listening to the podcast don't know, it's great. So, Colleen Rooney, right, was finding out that stories were being leaked to The Sun, and it appeared to be only stories from her Instagram. So, what she does, my wife's looking at me with aghast that I'm talking about this. It's all about Brexit when you think hard enough about it. I promise. Promise. So, Colleen Rooney, realised that stories were being leaked to The Sun, and they happened to be on her Instagram. So she had an idea about who it was, and she went about blocking people on her Instagram, making it private to only a select few, and posting deliberately fake stories onto her timeline to see which ones would make it to The Sun or not. So she kept blocking...
this is amazing. This is properly... this is worthy of such great detectives as Miss Marple and you know, the Belgian sleuth himself, Poirot. Yes,
yeah. So she keeps doing it until she's got down to one, and this is all done in like the iPhone Notes app. You know how all news is delivered on Twitter nowadays in that app, and a screenshot of it. And so she said, I narrowed it down to one, and that person is. And then she does like 12 dots. She puts a dramatic pause in the statement. It's amazing.
Amazing. This is the most Agatha Christie thing. So I now get why it's been called. Okay, carry on.
And the person is, dramatic pause, Rebecca Vardy, who is another footballer's wife of oh god, I've forgotten his first name. What's Vardy's first name?
Vardy?
Jamie Vardy. Yes, that's it. I can't believe you're correcting me on a football thing. God, okay.
I mean, top hit when I searched for Rebecca Vardy, which auto-filled because it's clearly in the news.
Exactly. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah. So, she's the wife of Jamie Vardy. You know, Wayne Rooney and Jamie Vardy were former England teammates, strike partners. So, Colleen Rooney feels she has been betrayed by Rebecca Vardy. Rebecca Vardy has said that, you know, it wasn't her, and her defense is that lots of people have access to that Instagram account. But as in a response, The Sun have started deleting all the fake stories that were leaked to them through this account. People think that it's like, it went big on Twitter. Everybody thought it was amazing that you had this little like detective scenario played out in public. But it's got a bit lame now that there were people in Parliament today mentioning it. I think somebody said that the government's promised to have 20,000 police officers on the street, or they could just invest in one Colleen Rooney to do all their work for them.
Oh dear.
Which is like, oh dear, politicians trying to get in the cool meme. Now you've made it uncool. Now we can't talk about it. But
it's like when I first uttered yeet.
Oh god, it's losing its cultural value every time you say it, Tom. So just
as I said on Friday, I know all the conjugations of the verb yeet, which was much better when it was an off-the-cuff remark and I hadn't had to say it 4 times.
Yort, yeeted, yat.
I think you yote.
Yote, okay.
He, she, yote. They yeeted, maybe. I think we worked out. I've also seen an amusing quote in Spanish with just yeet in the middle of it because that happened. Thanks, internet. But yes, sorry. So we've got slightly off topic here, but
slightly, but I'm fine with it. So
that's fine. So the Taoiseach, which is how I was told to pronounce it by the news quiz, so it must be right. He said some stuff about compromise. So there was some discussion about whether that's just, you know, there's a lot of, are the various EU leaders saying the right things in public because they need to appear to be compromising in public, even though they're just going to shoot down a deal as a general kind of note, you know, like, is that what they're doing? Because there's often been talk of like Merkel, you know, she's very, I mean, obviously Merkel does want a deal if we can get one, but there's still these red lines the EU leaders don't want to cross. So the question is, you know, is some of this more for show, just to show that the people at home hey, we are trying to get a deal as much as we can, but in the end, will it all fall apart? But I think you've noted as well a story I saw earlier in the week that even Rees-Mogg has talked about compromise.
Yeah, it feels like it's getting a bit real for the government now. We've had a dramatic swing in the last 2 weeks. So the government leaked an odd story, or not really leaked, the conversation between Boris Johnson and Angela Merkel, where Merkel said, look, your alternative plan for the backstop is rubbish. It doesn't meet our red lines. This deal's not going to happen. And then everybody kind of started playing the blame game, saying that, it looks like the EU are the ones to scupper this deal because they won't change their minds. And I've left it here that it had a quite distasteful tweet from the Leave EU people on Twitter, where it essentially said that we didn't fight 2 wars against the Germans for one of them to tell us what to do. But it said it in somewhat blunter terms and left a lot of people. I think even Piers Morgan found it untasteful, which is...
Wow.
Yeah, for Piers Morgan to find something distasteful, that's going quite far. So
famously listed on the MASH Report's list of wankers.
Yes, I'm not surprised. And to have, I think even Aaron Banks, the person who is sort of like the head figure of Leave EU, apologised for the tweet. So that shows you like how far it went. So at that stage, the deal seemed dead. And then, like you said, they had the meeting with Leo Varadkar, the Irish Taoiseach, who had more positive words to say, saying that a compromise would be made. And you've mentioned Mogg saying that there could be a compromise. Mogg even had an interview today with Sky where there was one of them. Let me see if I can find the actual tweet. Yeah, so the video is essentially somebody at Sky saying, look, the deal you've put forward is extremely similar to the one Theresa May put forward 4 times and rejected, and was a deal that you rejected 3 times out of that 4, and was a deal that you publicly slammed, essentially, and said wasn't worth the paper it was written on. Why is it different now? Which is a very fair point. The Brexiteers may have backed themselves into a bit of a corner with how anti-Europe they've been. Like, all deals require concessions from both sides. The fact that they've been playing hardball up until this point and suddenly may have to concede at the end might weaken their position. However, it might be that the government's been playing a blinder, and the threat of what they wanted to do all along was put the threat of no deal and make no deal such a realistic threat that it forced the EU to concede something. Even if it means the UK has to concede, then maybe those negotiation strategies have worked all along. The art of the deal, it's a difficult one to comprehend, but the government is trying to get away with the win here.
I feel we missed the opportunity to make an art of the deal joke about Trump's book.
Yes, definitely. We don't want Trump involved in Brexit, I think, after...
I think we can safely say he can stay well away, please. I like Trump where he currently is, the other side of an ocean.
Definitely. So we've gone from being, dismissive that a deal will happen to the Irish PM saying no one's entirely likely, and the noises I've seen coming out of Brussels in the coming days have kind of been, look, we actually still think a deal is a way away, and that they don't think one will be done by the 31st. That they think the most likely thing to happen now will be another extension, because we're not in a position to do a deal yet, that the 2 sides haven't met, but they feel that talking is still the best way forward on this.
So what are the possibilities at this point? What can happen? We have this, as we say, we have these e-leader meeting on Thursday, which I mentioned earlier. We have, as we say, a high likelihood of an extension. Boris going in with some kind of deal that will probably get shot down. Where's this going for Boris?
Okay.
Where's this going for us as well, actually?
Yes. So I think, scenario number 1, Boris negotiates a deal that the EU approves of. He takes it to Parliament and it gets passed. I think in that instance, Boris wins in a way. He was able to get what May wasn't able to do. I think he could probably sell that as a victory for his Brexit do or die by the 31st. He would sell that as, we threatened them with no deal, and that forced them to back down. My strategy worked. And under that sort of groundswell, he could go to the general public and possibly win an election. The risk for him there is that he's been gaining a lot of traction amongst hard Brexiteers, or people who might vote for the Brexit Party, who wanted who actively appear to be wanting a no deal, an absolute, like, no concessions given to the EU. And if the deal turns out to be bad, or can be spun by Nigel Farage to say, like, look, we're still giving too much to the EU, we're still in the EU in some ways, that might damage his re-election hopes. So, number one, I think that situation is unlikely at this stage. I think both the EU and the UK are too far away from a deal for that to happen. But I wouldn't be opposed to having a deal and avoiding a no deal. That would be really good. But it's kind of almost a riskier strategy for Boris Johnson's re-election. So number two is that there's no deal, but Boris is forced to extend Brexit by 3 months by the terms of the Benn Act. I think Boris can kind of wriggle his way out of this one. So Boris has always made it really clear that he wants to leave on the 31st. He can shift the blame to Parliament, saying, look, I wanted to leave, but Parliament made me have an extension. This Parliament is rotten. You know, we should elect a new Parliament that doesn't make me do this in the future. I think that argument...
Boris going to the Queen going, but Mum, Parliament made me do it.
Exactly. I think Boris could maybe get out of that one and come out with a majority. Polling at the moment, we'll go into a more detailed look at the polling for each parties in a bit. But I read some YouGov polling today that suggested that where people lay the blame with, they say who would do better in Brexit negotiations, Boris, Jeremy Corbyn, or Parliament. Boris Johnson is in the lead with 32% agreeing that he would be good in negotiations. I think it's 16% approve of Corbyn, and then only 12 believe that Parliament would do a good job. So that shows you where the British public's opinion on Parliament as a whole is at the moment.
I was going to say, though, fun poll fact, the Conservatives currently have 32% of the vote. Well, we'll get to the quick polls update shortly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's not necessarily surprising that people who would vote Conservative think Boris is going to be the best negotiator.
I hadn't put those two numbers together. Thank you for showing me that 32 equals 32. Yeah, no.
It does.
Yes.
Maths facts.
That does make a lot of sense. So, okay, yeah. Clearly Boris has been a divisive and polarizing figure. I feel that's fair to say. You either like him or hate him. As the old phrase goes, Jeremy Clarkson is like Marmite. Disgusting. So he clearly has that base of support, but if that base is enough to win him at a general election, I guess is the big question that will be faced. But I feel that in a scenario where he doesn't get a deal by the 31st, but is forced to extend, Boris might be able to get a general election victory if an election is called afterwards. The third scenario, Boris gets a deal and Parliament rejects it. This might almost be a dream scenario for Boris, because then he can definitely shift the blame to Parliament and say, look, you were so determined to avoid a no deal, and I got you a deal, and you rejected it. Still, after all this time, you won't be pleased with anything. I'm going to go to the country. Again, I feel that's probably a slightly better scenario than number 2 for Boris Johnson, but a worse scenario for the country. And finally, scenario number 4, we get no deal. No extension is agreed by the EU. We're forced to go into a no deal. Boris might get a very short-term boost amongst Brexiteers, but I feel that as the long-term effects of a no-deal Brexit come into play, if you get the economic effect that's forecast, then that will really affect his re-election hopes. And that, bizarrely, might be the worst scenario for Boris, when that's the one he seems to have been pushing for the most.
Although, presumably that relies on some of those effects coming into play before a general election. So let's say, no deal, no extension, we fall out of the EU on the 31st. Well, we know he doesn't have a majority in Parliament, so he'd be forced to call a general election pretty quickly. do you think enough people would be swayed by the effects of no deal in like a few weeks? Because, you know, the election campaign could be over quite quickly. So I suppose the question is, would the initial shock of of no deal be enough? Or is it actually the long-term effects that people are going to grumble about more?
So I think if it's a no deal vote, then it becomes an election. It becomes an election about Brexit. And I think the Conservatives' position on Brexit is probably stronger than Labour's position at the moment. I don't think Labour want to particularly fight an election on Brexit. They want to fight it on social issues and say that their social programme is the one that's going to be bringing the country forward. So if that were to happen, if it goes out with a no deal, then Boris is likely to gain maybe some ground if there's no apparent effects. We are talking Boris and Brexit again. I'm really, really sorry. It's all we've got to talk about. The 31st, things might change after the 31st. If there is any deal and it moves away from that, then Labour have a better chance, kind of bizarrely. Does that make sense? Sorry, I feel like I'm...
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think what you're getting at. I do wonder if Boris could time things well in that situation and come out of it rather well at the same time.
He could, but I think it's a narrower window. I think if you were to... General election campaigns tend to, and traditionally have been fought over 6 week periods. If you had a no-deal Brexit and then 6 weeks where Parliament isn't able to enforce any legislation because of purdah, and the country could slide in a country without government for 6 weeks after a no-deal Brexit would be quite bad, I feel. That's where you see a government of national unity rather being formed than a general election and allow them to sort the short-term crises out before the big ones. So that's why I feel that the timing window for Boris Johnson is very narrow, and he's probably lost that now. His ability to call a general election before the 31st is where he had his best shot if he was going to. The thing about him getting a no deal is that he always had to call the general election before the 31st, get the majority, go ahead with the no deal, and then have the power to enact his sort of radical no deal policies before anybody could stop him. I feel if no deal happens, and Boris is unable to, and Boris is in a parliament that doesn't support those radical policies, then he's weakened quite a bit and has lost that timing window, if that makes sense.
So with all of that said, let's have a look at the polls. I did give you a bit of a spoiler earlier. So as always, we go over to the kind of rolling average of the polls. And, I mean, there's been a dip for the Conservatives, a slight one, and then they're on the rise again. I just do not understand these polls very regularly. Labour is on kind of a general downward trajectory. It's been a little steeper in the up to the 6th of October. So again, we have this week delay on the polls. Lib Dems steadily climbing. Lib Dem surge. Sorry, let me say that properly. Lib Dem surge. But yeah, I mean, the Lib Dems are now 3% off Labour. That's getting close. And I think that's probably buoyed by various Conservatives joining them.
Yes, they are. They've been surprisingly resilient. They've got Conservatives coming towards them, which makes them more of a party of the centre. And as we've always mentioned, their Brexit policy is arguably clearer than Labour's. I think the line I've seen on Labour Twitter at the moment is that, we back a referendum. I had a piece of... have you been getting leaflets through your door as well from various political parties? I've had one from the Lib Dems, Labour, and the Conservatives in the past 3 weeks. Yeah, it depends where you live. But what was really interesting about the Labour flyer I got through my door is it said that this person standing for Labour on Brexit, the specific words were, in the Southwest, Labour will campaign to remain. Which... Oh,
that's very specific.
Well, yeah, it had been, my understanding of the party conference was that Labour was going to try and do a Brexit deal and then have a referendum on the issue, a referendum in which they supported their deal, not Remain. So to see that worded as in this region where we know Remain is popular, we will support Remain. I wonder what that leaflet is like in the north of the country or in other more Leave voting constituencies if they change the message there. And it's that difference in message and me thinking that I've finally got Labour's policy on Brexit sorted, and then seeing that come through my door and being confused is what probably is affecting the Labour slide or slight slide that they've had in the polls recently. I think the fact that Labour has been unable to capitalise on maybe the slight dip in Conservative form, and that you're seeing the biggest rise amongst those in the Liberal Democrats, the Brexit Party has mopped up the rest, the ones that feel that Conservatives maybe aren't being Brexity.
Yeah, I just want to say, if you look over the last week or so, and I mean, if you're on the website we have linked in our show notes, you can take your mouse onto this diagram and it will come up with these little dots that look like balls, showing you all the percentages. And you slowly drag that to the right, you can literally see the Brexit Party bounce in the polls, which is quite fun. Quite soothing, really. But yes, no, I mean, they have had a big bounce, and so it's Brexit and Liberal Democrats going up and taking away from their respective. It's almost like it's almost like for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Like, precisely. These are linked parties almost, and you can just see the voters moving back and forth between them.
Here's a fun bit of maths if you want to do this, Tom. So add together the percentages for the Conservative and Brexit Party. What number do you get? I
get 45%.
Now add together the numbers for the Labour and Liberal Democrat percent. What do you get?
I also get 45%.
And maybe that's the maths we're working with. Maybe we've just got 45% of the country in one way and 45% country the other way, but they're all kind of fighting amongst the two sort of splits, as it were.
Yeah. And I mean, it could lead to, as we've said before, with first past the post, it could lead to a very interesting vote. Because in an election where the Conservatives have more votes, they don't necessarily win significantly more seats overall. Sometimes, and also we tend to see a kind of narrowing between them and Labour. I wouldn't be surprised if we see the Lib Dems and Brexit lose a bit in the run-up to an actual general election.
Yeah, precisely.
But also, I think it's interesting here because, we often talk about the Lib Dems taking away from Labour, but there's now this big portion of Brexit Party who could, decimate Conservative polling numbers in certain areas, which could then allow a Labour MP to slip through somewhere where there's not a strong Liberal Democrat presence, for example, because of how the parties are spread out across the country, and especially with the Lib Dems, there are certain places they always tend to win. I don't think necessarily they're going to be winning in the north of England as much, for example. So there could be a potential situation where Labour actually does quite well, despite polling lower than the Conservatives on average, because in those areas the Brexit Party could actually be taking away from the Conservatives and not Labour.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the weird way that our parliamentary system works, and it really shows that going into the general election, whenever it is, I suspect it'll be this year, it really will come down to very fine margins in key areas of the country. It might be an election campaign that is fought constituency by constituency on quite local issues, with the background of a huge national issue of Brexit over everything. It's going to be a scrap, and I can promise you that.
And I think we might actually be ending on an interested note, not a downer this week.
Yes, so. Thank you. There's too many downers. Don't want to end on one today.
Yeah. So thank you as always for joining us. Hope you enjoyed our slightly longer than usual dive into UK politics. There is still a crossover episode with Mishmash Mayhem that I need to put up as a special. Haven't quite got around to that because of life reasons this week, but that special is on its way, and it will pop in between two normal episodes, hopefully next week. When I'm on holiday, I'll have some free time to finally actually edit that, I think. That shall hopefully go up then. And sorry, we've just had a joke from the chat about our endings. For your regularly scheduled news, go to number 10 Downer Street, and that's from our occasional contributor Ev. So thanks, Ev. Lots of things on the horizon. Brexit is happening, as I'm sure you know. So we will see what happens with that. we'll hopefully be able to circle back and do another special episode on Indonesia. We'll see what happens with fitting that in. And yeah, thank you as always for listening. If you like the show, you can find us in all the places we usually list. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Unparl Podcast. You can find us on Reddit /r/unparliamentary. You can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/TTSS, where you can support all of our shows if you are so inclined. And as I've been saying the last few weeks, the most helpful thing you can do for us if you really like the show, to spread the show, is just tell people you like it, because podcasts are spread mostly by word of mouth. So that really helps. And of course, you can always give us a review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast app you use. Just going to say on that at this point, I might not keep this in, but I looked back at, I re-downloaded an app the other day that we used to advertise for back in the day, and now charges an obscene amount for advertising revenue, sadly. Because I was like, oh, do you mind if we do another one of the free advert things? That, oh, we don't do that anymore. And I went on there and I saw our podcast and I saw it was rated 2 stars. And I was like, what? And there was one guy who'd left a comment saying, oh, it's just 2 blokes sitting around a microphone. I was like, I think you've misunderstood what podcasts are. I suppose someone coming from the BBC or something might not understand that some podcasts are just 2 people chatting around a microphone, or a number of people chatting around a microphone. But, oh well.
That's fine.
Anyway, if you want to go and undo that person's unjust 2-star review, let's go and give us a 5-star review on your favourite app of choice. And I suppose there's nothing else left to me to say than it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.